So we talked a bit about last time with Express, particularly about the C part, the controller, the router slash controller, meaning how we bind requests based on different HTTP verbs and path parameters or relative URLs that come into our application. The model part, as we know, is the part that is application independent, if you will. It's our interface from how we route into a set of business objects and business logic in order to do whatever it is that the application is supposed to do, whatever happens in our domain, if you will. So this one I want to talk more about the view part, the V part of MVC. We've talked for some time, or in multiple cases, about this notion of mixing content into our application code. So for example, when we looked at CGIs, we said CGI is one of the problems where we had to output the entire page and mix HTML output with the rest of our program. The same thing with server-side scripting, right? It was a mix of outputting the markup with stuff. We've looked at plain examples like last time. Let's see, express routes, right? We have this outputting of our response of plain strings associated with stuff. In fact, we had better ones of these, right? We had express listens, hello from express. We had simple routes, right? These one-line callbacks. And again, back to this one where, we're outputting stuff that's going straight to the screen is the point. We're basically doing print lines to the print stream that goes straight to the output stream. And that tightly couples it, right? We got markup all spread around our code, which makes it impossible to maintain. So we want to decouple the view. And the nice thing about the view is that it maps most nicely. It maps the nicest to our separation of concerns. We talked about those separation concerns up front in our conceptual talk. We talked about this notion of the business logic coming from models, right? We talked about this part, right, corresponding to that. We talked about data access being this decoupled part where we're trying to decouple the persistent store from the model. We said we didn't really have a part of the separation of concerns that was worried about this part. This is the web as adapter part, and is really how we're structuring that adapter to delegate into, this is app specific, and this part over here is independent and used by many apps. I drew you that diagram as well. That scribble. But what's nice is, all the conversation up there is all well and good. We're down here where we have a presentation concern, rendering logic, and we have views that map to them one-to-one. This is the one part of the MVC pattern that maps one-to-one with our traditional separation of concerns. So the view is responsible for rendering a response in whatever the target payload format is. Whatever we're going to render, and we could render in HTML, XHTML, we could render to XML, we could render to JSON, we could render to plain text. We remember any media format, any content type format that we want. The view as it is supposed to be a read-only. So I have this bolded because this is incredibly important. The view layer must not change the state of the model. We're past that part, right? Back when way back up here a couple slides ago when we talked about this part in the 1 through 5 of our template pattern, right, our steps of the template pattern, we're past, right? Step 3 was go and do your stuff, whatever the stuff is. Part 4 is we're done with that. So our view can't go back in this step and go start doing stuff here and changing state of the model again, invoking behaviors, because we're past that step in our template pattern. At this point, the state of the world, as it's called, our world model state, has been updated by whatever action the user's taken, and now we're going to read the resulting state and project it via view. That's essentially what we're doing here, okay? So let's go all the way back to where we were, all right? And say this has to be a read-only thing. And that's another reason why it's important to separate out this technology, whether it's template-based or not, whatever the view is, because these views will have typically their own scripting-oriented programming language of their own. That's one of the drawbacks, is they kind of have these hokey, homegrown scripting-type formats to them. It's a whole new little mini language to learn, if you will, just like server-side scripting when I talk about some of those homegrown solutions. But the nice thing is those things are built to only do things that impact what you render and do in the screen. They're not they don't have and shouldn't have state changing, world model state changing features and functionality. If they do, if that happens in your view, then you are in fact violating the MVC pattern, not adhering to it, no matter what technology base you do. All right. So you're projecting a view. That projecting is like the relational algebra projection operator. It's a window into the model, right? So this is a view. These are, think of these as little binoculars looking into the model to say what state, what read-only values of the state do I want to take and put into a response that I want to render. And again, that render response, we're thinking HTML. That's what we're going to be doing. But if you are an API person, it could be JSON, right? So view is taken in the generic sense of the term here, even though the most common use case for us in terms of application writing is HTML. There's a whole raft of view technologies. The ones we're going to talk about are templates, and templates have been around forever, for a very long time. Their benefit is very straightforward in their simplicity. They have some potential coupling. There is the hardwiring of layout. So templates typically look at a page in this page-oriented framework I was saying, and saying, I want all my pages, my page is going to have a banner. My page might have a top layer nav strip. It might have a left nav as well. And then it might have some content or features that it puts in here, and it's very kind of box ring oriented layout. They typically hardwire the layout into what the template looks like. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but that's what most templated sites kind of do for that. Node has plenty of templates. I mean, again, in Java we have a bunch of template engines. We've had template engines like Apache's Velocity and FreeMarker and so forth for literally 20 years now. But Node has its own version of templates. It had one called Jade that's now been renamed to Pug, and it has this one called EJS. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those. I have simple examples of each one of those. When you use them with Express, it's still the responsibility of this main app engine, this app variable that we were talking about. But now we're going to call the engine part and set up our views that we want to do. So effectively, again, back in our pattern here, and yeah, I've again, like I like to do, made a complete mess of this. Let me clean it up a little bit, and there, that's probably enough. What I'm talking about right now is this part. Right? We already had a route to a controller and delegate off into the model part. Now the controller also has to pull in what template it wants to use to apply in what situation. That's still the job of the controller. The controller still has to know the application logic in terms of what's supposed to be rendered, what's supposed to be read, and it was the one that read the request in the first place to help it do its routing. It's also going to use that request information to determine what view to apply. So it may look at the user agent and know it's a view field. It may know information from the headers about the nature of the browser that you're using and its capabilities, and even security things. All the information that comes in from the request that tells the server about the client and its capabilities may play a role in terms of what you want to view. We'll also see, we'll talk a little bit later about responsive web design, that there's such a thing as called adaptive web design, where the controller also responds to perhaps additional presentation parameters, meaning some of the things that come in the query string, in the path parameters, in the request headers, may be specifically meant for the controller to make the decision in this direction, not the decision in this direction. Okay. So Pug in EGS, this is what these kinds of things are. Let's take a look at the code again. Here's the Express templates example. All right, we got to require Express. Notice how we have new modules here, Pug and EJS, that we have to bring. This one example is using both template ones. I mean, you wouldn't do that in reality. You would pick one or the other, if you will. You wouldn't mix and match. But either way, part of the reason that they are in the same example here is you can see the similarity, right? We still make the app engine call to determine what view engine we're using. Here we have one named Pug, one named HTML for the EJS. We set up our listen, and now we're setting a bunch of locals, right? These are properties on a locals object: new name, vehicle, terrain, climate, and location. And then we're doing our routing using path parameters to the Pug rendered pages in the EJS rendered pages. All right, what do the actual views themselves look like? Well, the EJS file, this is an EJS file. And look, this is more like a server-side scripting language, right? We have raw HTML tags that we're used to seeing combined with this embedded syntax of these percent signs, right? All these guys right here. This is not HTML. Right? This is the part that the EJS engine is going to pick up on when it's rendering back out. Okay, so EJS has the benefit of looking like HTML. Your front-end graphic design, graphic information types are going to be familiar with the HTML, and then there's just this notion of embedding in it these percent directives, as they're called. All right, so you're going to see that. Now this one's using a percent equals directive, and that is the simplest form, because if you notice, these are all the names of the app.locals that we had in our code. And that's what percent equals does. It basically just does a lookup on app.locals for these individual property names, which again is exactly what we had over here. Right? So very easy correspondence. You name it here, you set it here, you go back over to the template, and boom, there you have. Use the corresponding ones. Simple enough. Now, of course, this is not showing you some more advanced features that you can have in EJS, other ways of computing values and deriving values, other ways of doing simple iterators and conditionals and the like. It is not the intent to make you sophisticated front-end designers, but the point is we've now structured a page and dynamically filled in information coming from the program in a completely different file. And once we have it, we set it up and wire it with the app engine, the EJS module takes over and it will render our page looking like this. We have a similar thing with Pug. Here we have now Pug looks a little bit more like almost like a markdown format, right? We don't have, clearly we have a structured outline of a doc type HTML, what the HTML language is. We have the head and body that you would normally see. But the syntax is quite different, and each one of these things is considered almost DOM-like in its presentation. We have this content notion that we have to fill in, and this is a literal value. So now we've got to find some way to bind that content in. We also have a second one that's a user pug. The user pug is more like that other EJS. It's going to have a simpler, it's going to be shorter because it's not as verbose with all the HTML stuff in it. But notice that this is basically going to render the same kind of thing that the EJS did. A few interesting features here. First of all, it indicates that it's extending the main pug, right? So when we go back to main pug, this is just the structure of the overall document. This is actually going in this user pug and saying, I'm going to extend that and block content. I'm going to bind in this way. And by the way, I'm going to use those same app.locals, but with a little different syntax. We have the hashtag or pound sign syntax with brackets to then indicate what property we want to read and render here. And again, a markdown like syntax instead of closed tags and HTML syntax. But pretty straightforward examples. You can kind of see what's going on, and a nice feature in Pug where you can build templates off of templates. So now when you look at this page that looks like this with these different parts to it that I drew over there with the left top nav and banner and left nav and so forth, now I can start looking at a master Pug, overall main Pug file, and I can start looking at each one of these things being its own something.pug, something.pug. This could be topnav.pug, and now I can kind of reuse even parts of the page, all right, in different ways. I guess this is top, this would be banner.pug, and now I can start kind of using a composite or aggregation pattern to reuse content and just have the truly dynamic parts vary what Pug template I bring in to render what content. So now I've kind of got this little building blocks oriented way of constructing my templatized pages. When we can go ahead and run this. All right. Now what happened there? All right. Well, again, I can't find module Pug. I've got to go ahead and npm install or create a package.json for. I'm going to do an npm install of Pug. Taking a moment, thinking about it. I just paused for a second because that actually wound up taking about half a minute for reasons I don't know why. I'm not worried about the warning here. I can go back and try and run, and now it can't find EJS, so I've got to do the same thing with EJS as you might expect. Let's see if that one goes faster. I might pause again. Oh, that one went a little bit faster. So let's clear this up and run our node example. Now we're cooking with gas. We're running again. Let's see, what port did I have for this one? I'm doing an app.listen on 8080, so let's go over to 8080. And remember, we have /pug and /EJS. So if I go to 8080/pug, right, there's a user using the pug template, and EJS, there's user using EJS. Looks exactly the same except for the text in the header, one block. But again, the template files are a little bit different, but also nice maintainable code because from the perspective of Express and using these templates, right, I set up the locals for either one. I set up the locals, and this code, the only code that's really different is how I set up these callbacks. Right, here's a response.render here. Here it's a little bit longer in terms of bringing in the render of the EJS HTML with its own callback that then didn't send, right? But in essence, this setup and this setup is the only thing that is really all that different, and it's not that different to start with. Everything else up here was exactly the same. I don't know that I have a preference, one templating thing over the other. There's the pros of EJS. Again, sticking with HTML markup, it provides a nice direct mapping as well as familiarity for your graphic designers. Pug requires a slightly different syntax, markdown type syntax, although markdown syntax is these things are much more common nowadays. Folks get used to them quickly. After time, it's a little bit more terse. It's not as verbose, and again, it has this nice feature of extending different templates and the like. But really, 6 eggs in one hand, half a dozen in the other, kind of thing. So to wrap up, so that's templates in a nutshell, and I think the concept's fairly straightforward. Applying those things, there's this mix and match of static and dynamic content, as most pages are, with its holes and these boxy layouts, as we were talking about, this cookie cutter design. It's still nice separation of concerns because now we've separated things out into the template file, and the wiring that goes on even in your code, the app.local setup and the invocation of the engine, if you will, can still be put in its own code that can be readily identified as step 4 of our template pattern. It's also Ajax friendly, meaning the holes in some of the layout. These holes can also be, I'm erasing, not circling. These holes can also be filled in, as we'll see in the client side, with Ajax-y type stuff, so I can make a call and actually defer what goes in here through a client-side call coming back to an API, or to grab a piece of markup, again, something that we'll be talking about a little bit later in the course. It lets each developer stick to what it's good at. So the nice thing, again, about separation of concerns and this one-to-one mapping, it means I can train people with different skill sets in usability, skill sets in graphic design, on my templating technology choice, have them create the artifacts and worry about those things, and they're entirely in charge of the presentation concern. Once we have an information model for the flow across different pages, back to this part again, and we understand page to page what it is we want to have appear and where we get that information from, my application developers worry all about this stuff, and my graphic, up here, this direction, and my graphic designers and user experience people worry about this. In fact, in reality, what I really have are app people here, app independent or service people here worrying about my business logic, and I have my user experience people here, and I have these nice separation concerns even in how I organize teams and technology frameworks, which is one of the benefits we talked about in the conceptual lecture. All right. The UI starts with the markup, not the other way around. That means I don't have to go to code, start outputting markup, and have people understand where to go. I mean, if I have my graphic technology people having to go into code and know where to change markup stuff. I don't want those people in my code, to tell you the truth. They change the wrong thing and things could blow up. Some of the cons: there's not a lot of layout flexibility. It's not very responsive. It's adaptive in a sense, trying to build in responsivity, if you will. That's the job of CSS that we'll talk about a little bit. And sometimes our layouts are a little bit too hardwired and boxy. And then you have these proprietary scripting languages. Again, you have an expense invested in learning what these little embedded scriptlets do, if you will, staying up with what that community is doing when they rev their markup, their scripting language and the like, finding tooling around them to do syntax checks and the like. Right, when we're in here inside of this Pug template, this is Brackets, a very well known editor, but it's not doing syntax highlighting. I probably have to go out and look for an extension of Brackets that understands Pug templates. Right? When I'm over here, I have some syntax highlighting, but that syntax highlighting is actually built into thinking it's HTML, and it's actually not doing the right syntax highlighting anymore because it doesn't realize that this is actually supposed to be part of a template because it has the HTML extension. So again, I've got to look for some kind of proprietary IDE extension to take care of my tooling, as well as things like unit testing, the whole 9 yards down the line kind of thing, if you will, gets affected by what technology choice that I make. And then there's some. I mean, it's not insurmountable. It's not that big a deal, but it's something an organization has to do, and they're kind of coupled to it for the time being, because these things have a history of templating engines have a history of rising up and fading out over time, and you wind up having to migrate a bunch of templates, is what I'm trying to say. There are other techniques. You can use XML SLT, and this is actually a special form of templating. So you could try and keep your content models in something agnostic like XML or even JSON, and then use an XSLT or a JSON processor to transform to the target markup. HTML, there used to be something called WML, again, JSON, XHTML, whatever it is that you're rendering. So you're essentially trying to make very explicit the separation between content model and rendered model in what you do. This was a computationally expensive XSLT. There's still folks doing it. My team was responsible for building a very large system based on this, and we had a number of optimizations that made it very fast, and it really worked. I mean, that system's actually still running after 20 years in the same way. But as much as there's a lot of XML, XSLT out there for transformation of XML across different domain models, using it for the use case of transforming it to a markup language, not as much anymore. There's also this notion of browser plugins and embedded viewers, things like Flash, Silverlight, and excuse me, and even way back in the day, Java applets and stuff like that. Those things would embed full UI state in a downloaded object and then make AJAX-like calls or try and go back to the server to accept presentation information and use their player-specific way of rendering it. But those things are rapidly falling away. I mean, Flash isn't dead yet still. In 2018, I'm recording this. Not dead yet, but certainly declining in popularity in favor of the rich features that we see in HTML5. Okay, so what kinds of things have we covered in MVC? We've talked a lot, by the way, about the C part in the first routing part of Express, and now the view with the templates. Not so much the model part, and again, because the model part is actually independent. It labels a part of the system that is independent of the web application itself. So this stuff is, again, the independent stuff, and it's the stuff we have to access. We delegate to via the controller, and we render in the view, but the model itself is something that can be manipulated, read, and so forth by a variety of applications, not just your web application, which is why we haven't talked about it that much. That's more generic programming, if you will. Right? We have our incoming request, and these are our steps again, right? Incoming request, check, we do that. We delegate to the business layer. We use routes for that, and perhaps an intermediate controller. We have this notion of world model state coming out of the M part. And again, you can use flat file systems. You can use relational databases that you learned about. You can use NoSQL databases. You can have a set of domain objects in front of them that encapsulate the business logic and use their own object relational mapping tier. All that data access stuff stuff. That's not a place we've gone so far with our material. That's just the big black box that sits at the end, and that's where we're going to leave it. We're worried about our application specific features. We factored presentation into a rendering later. We're basing it on templates, but again, templates are just one specific instance of something. In some technologies, like servlets, you can actually have the same framework, right? A servlet can be a rendering servlet as opposed to a controller servlet, or even a filtering servlet, right? That's servlets, but the same thing in our node part. As long as we have well modularized code, we could decouple rendering. Even if we do wind up, what I'm saying is putting embedded markup inside our JavaScript code node, we could do that and still maintain separation of concerns, provided we have all that stuff in the right place, in the same place, if you will. All right, as opposed to having it bled throughout our code, right? When it starts to bleed throughout our code, that means we're not organizing our code in good principles according to the MVC pattern, and we have something that's going to wind up a mess and we're not going to be able to maintain. Views bind values as symbols for use in the template. We've seen that very simply with the app.locals. Pretty low tech, pretty straightforward, but it's very simple, right? Even though you've never seen those templating languages before, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, that's no big deal, right? That's just an object I passed in with certain properties, and I have a syntax for retrieving those values back out in the template, and boom, I'm done. That's all it took to do what's called data binding, one-way or two-way data binding. We send a response back or render a response still using our res.end, or now inside of Express our res.send, and we're done. We saw that with the res.render actually in the callbacks for each one of our templating engines. All right. MVC is the predominant web app design pattern. I don't care if you're talking front end, back end. I don't care if you're talking Java, JavaScript, Python, Perl, PHP. You're going to come across, Angular, whatever. You're going to come across front end and back end, whatever technology, a framework. The first thing it's going to probably tell you is, here's how we realize, meaning here's how we construct the MVC pattern for you. The second thing you realize those frameworks is we try to make those steps now of that template pattern, right? That's the origin of the problem that I talked about. Here's the convenience APIs we provide around that to make that work for you. Okay, so that's MVC. In Express, where we'll go next is we'll start talking about some of the middleware, some of the behaviors and decorators that you can add into the call chain. We saw one flavor of that with app.param next time. Now the next place we're going to go is talking about the full range, not the full range, but a more expanded range of what it means to have middleware and how that can decorate the functionalities to create even more powerful web apps.